Now we'll cross to Melbourne and catch up with the Parliamentary Secretary, the Shadow Parliamentary Secretary to the Opposition Leader Bill Shorten, and that is Michael Danby. Thanks for joining us, Michael.
Evening.
Look, Michael, I want to start off on the renewable energy debate, the climate policy debate. It's a key focus for your party, of course, in opposition. The Greens have today announced that they would deliver 90% renewable power by 2030. This, of course, trumps Labor's promise to deliver 50%. What would it cost to deliver 90% of our electricity from renewable sources?
Well, the Greens don't have to calculate that. It's simply an attempt to appeal to people's environmental idealism with apparently no idea of the costs. Our 50% by 2030 is an aspiration. We do feel, and Bill and Tanya's presence in Kiribati on some of those islands that are sinking beneath slightly rising seas is evidence of the fact that Labor is concerned that there is global warming. We regard it as science. But I think having unattainable aspirations, 90%, is economic cloud cuckoo land stuff.
Yeah, I don't want to get into an argument about Kiribati and the islands, but you'd be aware of recent research that shows most of those atolls actually expanding in size rather than disappearing just at the moment. But you're right, climate change is an issue that everyone's focused on around the world. But if you don't know what the Greens' policy of 90% renewables would cost, you surely also don't know what your own policy of 50% renewables will cost both the government and consumers.
Well, I'm confident that that Mark Butler and Bill understand that coal is still an export for Australia, that the people, for instance, of India who don't have electricity yet have the right to aspire to the same standards of living that we do, and therefore we have a social responsibility to continue to export coal. At the same time, you would admit that it's a big pollutant, a big polluter, and that the ways of using it ought to be refined, and the kind of coal that is produced, again, ought to be restricted to the kind of material that is the most efficient in producing energy. Yeah, look, of course, all of these things have costs.
Michael, the bottom line, surely, though, is if you're legislating, if you've got government policies to force the switch to renewables, it can only force consumers' power prices up.
Well, you know, the Greens are happy to do that. They, again, are never in government and therefore don't have to prosecute these ridiculous, incredibly high levels of renewables that they want to sort of appeal to young people's idealism over. Ours are targets that at the same time recognise that existing methods of energy, including coal, have to be produced in the interim.
Now, you're a pretty hardline critic against the Greens, which is kind of a problem, I suppose, because your party was in government in a coalition arrangement with the Greens only a couple of years ago. But now you reckon it's the Liberals who are getting too cosy with the Greens?
Well, Michael Kroger's talked about, and I met him in here, the studio, the other day, talked about exchanging preferences with them in wills now that there's going to be a replacement there. I think that would be very irresponsible. The Victorian State Liberals took a position of principle some years ago when they said they would put the Greens behind Labor, and that in fact helped them win the previous state election when Bailey won.
Yeah.
And I think it would undermine their credibility as both an economically responsible party and particularly a party that's committed to bipartisan national security and foreign policy that we have.
I think you're right. I think you're right. I think if the Liberal and National parties say that the Greens can only damage the economy and national security, then they should put them last everywhere and not play footsies with them, because you're very concerned also, aren't you, about what the Greens have been saying about the Islamist extremist challenge?
Well, I think they're just weak on that. But let me just come back and focus on Michael's rather naive musings about the new leader of the Greens, Mr. Di Natale. Yes, he's a new show bag, but it's the same content. I've done some exhaustive research on the Greens' national security and foreign policy, and I'm going to present it to him, and I'm going to say to him, you cannot, in all honesty, these are all statements on the public record in Hansard and in media releases, say that the Greens are any different now than they were under Christine Milne, still have the influences of Lee Rhiannon and that extreme view that it's all the West's fault for all of the problems that are happening in the Middle East. It's an intolerably naive view. It's a view that will bring more terrorism on us. It's a view that would have prevented the 5 tranches of legislation that Labor has supported the government after putting in various privacy caveats that we've put through the Parliament that would have prevented more terrorism happening here in Australia. If we didn't have that terrorism legislation, Chris, we wouldn't have known about that 14-year-old boy in London who planned with the 18-year-old in Melbourne to run down police officers at the Anzac Day recently in Victoria, in Melbourne. Now this would have been the kind of incident that's happened in France and that's recently happened in Israel, where you see some horrific scenes of these fanaticised young people driving cars into people peacefully standing at bus stops. We don't want that kind of stuff coming to Australia.
Yeah, I think if the horrible events in Paris have taught us anything, it's that those complaints about extra surveillance laws, metadata laws, extra funding for security agencies in Australia and the like are really exposed because it does underscore how this threat exists in Western countries still. Now, you knew that, and I knew that, and our viewers knew that. People have been warning about this for many, many years now. Do you think then, in reality, apart from that sort of justification, in reality, what's unfolded in Paris changes anything?
It does. It just shows you that the problem is can't simply be handled by the kind of legislation we've had in Australia, which is defensive. We've had to put those through, and we've done them, by the way, without any help from the Greens, with correct privacy caveats, with oversight by the Ombudsman, by the fact that it's coming back to the Intelligence Committee and to the Parliament in 2 years' time, i.e. sunset clauses. But what Paris shows is that as long as Daesh or IS have control of a huge geographic area, they can prosecute incidents like, well, it's understating it to call it an incident, the mass murder in Paris, or they can do like Al Cambodi, that disgraceful Australian member of Daesh, programming of young people in Australia. Both the deluded young fellow in Sydney and the deluded young fellow in Melbourne were both apparently in contact with him, and that's all done from Raqqa in eastern Syria.
Well, it's a terrorist safe haven. I mean, Islamist terrorism exists across the world, North Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and of course in the Middle East. But with that Islamic State stronghold, you have that terrorist base that we used to have in Afghanistan, the whole world united, including the United Nations, behind the war in Afghanistan to get rid of that base for terrorism. And that's effectively what we have now, recreated in an even more odious form, probably in northern Iraq and eastern Syria.
Chris, I don't advocate Tony Abbott's position of sending Western armies into eastern Syria to suppress Daesh, nor do I accept apparently the Prime Minister's weak and passive support for the desultory bombing campaign that the Americans are doing in Raqqa. It's not a matter of boots on the ground, it's a matter of whose boots on the ground. We've got our Kurdish friends 50 kilometres from Raqqa. They are untrained and unarmed. They don't have heavy weapons. We saw that they're willing to fight in Kobani. It was like the last stand of the Alamo. They fought the Daesh to the death while the Turkish troops stood with their tanks in the hills overlooking Kobani. They beat Daesh, and together with strategic Western bombing assistance, I believe eventually when they're trained and armed, together with Assyrian and Yazidi and Sunni Arab allies, these people should be formed into an army. They've been terribly mistreated by the people of Daesh. Their women have been raped, sold as sex slaves. Their civilization has been blown up, the temples and the ancient artefacts, and they really hate these people. And our allies, particularly the Kurds, have the same aspirations to get rid of IS as we do, and we do not have to be involved in a huge bloody Western attempt to interfere in an Arab country. We have less stake with what's going on with the Russians, the Syrians, Hezbollah and Iran in Western Syria, where Assad and the Russians are bombing 80% of the population who want democracy in Syria.
Okay.
But it's really our business in eastern Syria, in Raqqa, where these people are organising events around the world like Paris.
Now, just briefly, Ayaan Hirsi Ali said this week that the challenge for Europe, they should look to Israel, that Israel really is experiencing and obviously has long come to terms with the threat of Islamist extremism, and that Europe needs to learn lessons from the security apparatus in Israel. Now, that sounds rather dire, but it's also kind of smart, isn't it, that the Israelis have just picked up so many lessons over the years, combating the threat that we've seen them deal with, again, with random stabbing attacks, killing 17 people over the past month or so.
They've been in a terrible position. Remember, they had all of the suicide bombings like we've seen around the West a few years ago. They had to build that security fence, and the number of suicide bombings went down from over 1,000 in 1 year to zero. They have very good intelligence. They have lots of people who speak Arabic, lots of people who understand the extremist Muslim mindset, and at the same time they understand how we have to cooperate with Palestinians or Muslims or Arabs who do want to get along with us. We actually need them as our allies, but we've got to be sort of hard at intelligence. We've got to think of some of the methods that they've used to prevent worse terrorism happening in Israel. After all, Chris, all of this is connected. I was saying to Helen Daly the other day, the young fanatics sitting in their bedrooms being fanaticised by IS or Hamas, come to stab or run down people in Tel Aviv as much as they will in Paris or Washington, and they tried to do it here in Australia. Thank heavens in this last year we've only had 3 deaths as the result of this terrible lone wolf campaign that IS is running in countries where they can't get arms into.
Michael Danby, just before you go, I wonder if you can give me your reaction to these claims from Jackie Lambie, a senator with a lot of power in the Senate, obviously, but actually suggesting that refugees, after security checks and clearances coming into Australia from Syria, might have to have electronic ankle braces.
Foolish and counterproductive. If she wants to do something productive, add her voice to the Catholic Archbishop and the Christian clergymen who want to make sure that the persecuted minorities are allowed into this country. They are our best defence. Look at great Australians like Nick Culdis, who's a Coptic Christian, the Commissioner of Police in New South Wales, speaks fluent Arabic. He understands more about what's going on with the element that's trying to destroy Australia than practically anyone else. And I mean, in Jackie Lambie's world, we'd have an anklet bracelet put on Nick Culdis's relatives.
Yeah, let's hope that's the last we hear of that. Thanks very much for joining us tonight, Michael Danby.
Thanks, Chris.